Picture this: a narrow mountain pass where 300 warriors stand shoulder to shoulder, shields locked, facing an empire's endless tide. The air is thick with the clash of bronze and the cries of men who know they will not leave this place alive. This is Thermopylae, where King Leonidas and his Spartans carved their names into history with sheer defiance. But theirs is just one story in a tapestry of final stands that stretch across centuries, each a blazing moment where courage met its ultimate test. These aren't just battles, they're turning points where the fate of civilizations hung in the balance, and the choices of a few changed the course of the world. What drives warriors to stare down certain doom? Why do these last stands echo through time, long after the dust has settled? The answer lies in something deeper than strategy or strength. It's about the unyielding human spirit. These moments reveal who we are at our core, our capacity to fight for what matters, even when the odds are impossible. From the crumbling walls of Masada to the storm-lashed decks at Trafalgar, these battles are more than military defeats or victories. They're lessons in resilience, in leadership, in the raw power of belief, and they ask us a haunting question: what would we do if it were our last stand? Today, we're stepping into the footprints of those who stood where others would flee. We'll journey through 30 of history's most extraordinary final battles, epic clashes where courage defied the inevitable. Some you've heard of, like the Alamo's desperate defense or the samurai who chose honor over surrender. Others might surprise you, like the forgotten sieges and naval last stands that reshaped empires. But all of them share one thing: a legacy that outlived the fighters themselves. These stories aren't just about the past, they're mirrors held up to our own lives, reminding us of the strength we might not know we have. So take a breath, we're about to walk into the fire together. The narrow pass of Thermopylae was more than just a battleground. It was a funnel, a death trap where numbers meant nothing and courage meant everything. In the summer of 480 BCE, King Leonidas of Sparta stood there with his 300 warriors, joined by a few thousand allies, facing an empire that stretched from Egypt to India. Persia's King Xerxes had brought hundreds of thousands of soldiers, an army so vast it was said to drink rivers dry. But Leonidas knew something Xerxes did not: terrain can be a greater weapon than numbers. The Hot Gates, as Thermopylae was called, forced the Persians into a bottleneck where their overwhelming advantage vanished. Shield pressed against shield, the Spartans fought in perfect unison, their phalanx formation turning the narrow path into a wall of spears. For 3 days they held. Wave after wave of Persian troops broke against that unyielding line. Herodotus tells us that when Xerxes demanded the Greeks surrender their weapons, Leonidas replied with just 2 words: "Molon lebe, come and take them." It wasn't just defiance, it was a declaration. Every Spartan knew they would die there. Their oath was to return victorious or not at all, carried home on their shields. And when betrayal finally exposed a mountain path behind them, sealing their fate, they didn't flee. They chose to stand, to fight, to make their deaths mean something. The Persian perspective tells a different story. To them, this was a minor delay in an inevitable conquest. But history remembers Thermopylae not for who won the battle, but for what it came to represent. The Greeks lost the pass, yet their sacrifice rallied the fractured city-states. Within a year, Persia would be defeated at Salamis and Plataea, victories born from the spirit Thermopylae ignited. This wasn't just a last stand, it was a spark. Centuries later, it still burns as a symbol of resistance, of choosing principle over survival. But the Spartans weren't alone in this kind of defiance. Across the ancient world, from the steppes of Asia to the deserts of Africa, others would make the same choice, to fight knowing there was no way out. Their stories, like Leonidas, remind us that sometimes how you fall matters more than whether you stand at the end. High atop a wind-swept plateau in the Judean desert, 1,000 feet above the Dead Sea, the fortress of Masada became the stage for one of history's most haunting last stands. By the year 73 CE, the great Jewish revolt against Rome had been crushed. Jerusalem lay in ruins, the temple was destroyed, and legions patrolled the ashes of rebellion. But on this isolated rock, 960 men, women, and children held out, their defiance a flickering ember in the empire's shadow. For nearly a year, they endured siege, rationing drops of water and scraps of food, while below them, the 10th Legion built an earthwork ramp so massive its scars still mark the landscape today. The Roman commander Flavius Silva knew time was his ally. His army, nearly 15,000 strong, could wait. They carved a path up the cliffside, hauling a battering ram to crush Masada's walls. But when they finally broke through at dawn, they found only silence. According to the historian Josephus, the rebels had chosen death over chains. 10 men drew lots to slay the rest before taking their own lives. Only 2 women and 5 children, hidden in a cistern, survived to tell the tale. Yet even Josephus' account raises questions. No mass graves have been found on Masada, and some scholars argue his dramatic narrative served Roman propaganda, a warning against rebellion. But archaeology tells its own story. The siege ramp still looms over the desert, and excavations revealed arrowheads, charred storerooms, and even pottery shards possibly used in the fatal lottery. Whether every detail is precise, the core truth remains. This was a stand against erasure, a refusal to let Rome dictate their end. Centuries later, Masada's legacy was reborn. For modern Israel, it became a symbol of survival against impossible odds. Soldiers swore oaths atop the plateau, "Masada shall not fall again." The phrase echoes the rebels' resolve, though their choice, suicide over surrender, sparks debate even today. Was it courage or despair, a last act of agency or a tragic collapse? What's undeniable is how this siege transcends its moment. Like Thermopylae, it's a story shaped by those who told it, a mirror for every generation that faces its own empires. The desert winds still howl around Masada's stones, carrying whispers of that final night. Not all last stands are about winning battles. Some are about who controls the narrative. The rebels knew Rome would take their lives, but they denied them the victory of submission. In that way, their defiance still stands unbroken on the cliffs of memory. Deep in the mist-shrouded Teutoburg Forest, where ancient oaks stood like silent sentinels, Rome's unstoppable war machine met an end it never saw coming. The year was 9 CE, and 3 elite legions, 17,000 soldiers, marched confidently under the command of Publius Quinctilius Varus. They were the pride of Emperor Augustus, the iron fist of an empire that had never known defeat. But their guide, a Germanic chieftain named Arminius, had other plans. Raised in Rome as a hostage, he knew their tactics, their weaknesses, and he knew this forest. The ambush began with a storm. Torrential rain turned narrow paths into quagmires, forcing the Romans into a ragged column, their heavy armor and disciplined formations useless in the tangled wilderness. Germanic warriors erupted from the trees, their hit-and-run attacks whittling down the legions over 3 brutal days. There were no pitched battles here, just the relentless terror of an enemy that melted into the fog after every strike. By the end, not a single Roman eagle standard survived. The few prisoners taken were sacrificed to Germanic gods, their skulls nailed to trees as warnings. When Augustus received the news, he reportedly wandered his palace crying out, Varus, give me back my legions. Archaeology has peeled back layers of the forest's secrets. In the 1980s, metal detectors uncovered a trove of artifacts near Chalcis coins minted before 9 CE, bent Roman nails from makeshift barricades, even a mask from a cavalry helmet. These fragments paint a vivid picture, Romans desperately digging trenches, trying to form a defensive line as the noose tightened. The soil itself holds traces of massacre, with phosphate levels suggesting mass graves. What made Teutoburg so devastating wasn't just the loss of troops, it was the shattering of an idea. Rome had believed itself invincible, its expansion inevitable. After this, the Rhine became a permanent border, a line even Augustus dared not cross again. Arminius, once a footnote in Roman records, became a Germanic legend, though his own people later turned on him. History is ironic that way heroes of last stands rarely live to see their legacy. This wasn't just a battle, it was a masterclass in asymmetric warfare, proving terrain and local knowledge could topple empires. Similar echoes ripple through history: the Viet Cong's jungle ambushes, the Afghan Mujahideen's mountain resistance. Teutoburg reminds us that sometimes the underdog doesn't need to win the war. Just one decisive strike can change everything, and in the quiet of that forest, the leaves still seem to whisper the lesson: no empire is unbreakable. By the year 146 BCE, Carthage was a city living on borrowed time. For 3 years, Rome had laid siege to its ancient rival, the once mighty maritime power that had dared to challenge its dominance. Now the walls were breached, and the final act of a century-long grudge played out in the smoke-choked streets. This wasn't just a battle, it was an annihilation. The Romans, led by Scipio Aemilianus, advanced methodically, clearing districts house by house, alley by alley. Carthaginian fighters, backed into corners, turned temples into strongholds and rooftops into sniper nests. Even women and children hurled tiles from above, a desperate last gasp of a civilization fighting for its very existence. The air reeked of burning cedar and molten metal as fires spread through the city. Carthage's legendary harbor, once the envy of the Mediterranean, became a slaughterhouse. Historians like Appian describe scenes of unimaginable horror: streets slick with blood, libraries aflame, the dying wailing from collapsed buildings. Yet amid the chaos, Scipio, the conquering general, reportedly wept. Standing atop the citadel, watching the city burn, he whispered lines from Homer about the fall of Troy, as if foreseeing Rome's own fate centuries later. The moment captures the paradox of empire. Even the victors can't escape the weight of what they've destroyed. Then came the final indignity. According to legend, Roman soldiers sowed the earth with salt, cursing the land so nothing could grow again. It's a powerful image, one that's endured for millennia, but archaeology tells a more complicated story. Salt was precious in the ancient world. Wasting it would have been unthinkable. More likely, the salting was symbolic, a ritual act to mark Carthage's erasure from history, and erase it they did. The city's treaties, its language, even its gods were systematically scrubbed from the record. Rome didn't just want victory, it wanted oblivion for its rival, yet Carthage's ghost lingered. The fertile fields of North Africa were too valuable to abandon, and within a generation, Roman colonists settled on the ashes. The very crops Carthage had traded: olives, wheat, grapes, now fed Rome's empire. Irony runs thick here. The civilization Rome sought to obliterate became part of its own lifeblood. Today, Carthage's ruins lie beneath modern Tunis, a silent testament to how thoroughly empires rewrite history. But dig deeper, and you'll find Phoenician coins beneath Roman villas, hidden shrines to Tanit beneath Christian churches. Erasure is never complete. This wasn't just the end of a city. It was a warning about the price of unchecked ambition, the danger of reducing a people to a cautionary tale. Carthage's fate forced even Rome to confront a haunting question. If this could happen to the mighty, what might one day happen to us? The answer came centuries later, when barbarians sacked Rome itself, and the empire finally learned what it meant to be on the other side of history's sword. The rolling hills of Alasia became the stage for one of history's most audacious military gambles, a siege within a siege where Julius Caesar turned desperation into brilliance. In 52 BCE, the Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix rallied tribes against Rome, only to find himself cornered in this fortified stronghold. But Caesar, outnumbered and far from home, didn't just lay siege. He built not one, but two massive walls, an inner ring to starve the Gauls, and an outer one to repel their reinforcements. For weeks, his legions labored, felling trees, digging trenches, and studding the earth with sharpened stakes. The result was a death trap 15 miles around, a testament to Roman engineering and sheer willpower. Vercingetorix's defenders soon faced agonizing choices. Caesar's own commentaries describe how the Gauls, their food dwindling, expelled women and children from the gates, hoping the Romans would take them in. But Caesar refused, leaving the innocents to starve in the no-man's land between the walls. It was psychological warfare as much as physical, a calculated move to break the defenders' spirit. When relief forces finally attacked, the battle raged for days, a whirlwind of flaming arrows, cavalry charges, and desperate breaches in the Roman lines. At one critical moment, Caesar himself rode into the fray, his iconic red cloak a beacon for his men. What sets Alasia apart isn't just the tactics, but the surrender that followed. Vercingetorix, clad in his finest armor, rode out to lay his arms at Caesar's feet. Unlike Leonidas or the rebels of Masada, he chose life over martyrdom, perhaps hoping to negotiate. But Caesar had other plans. The Gallic leader was paraded through Rome in chains before his execution, his defeat marking the end of Celtic resistance. Some see his surrender as pragmatism, others as a missed chance for a defiant last stand. Yet his fate underscores a brutal truth. In the face of overwhelming force, even the boldest choices can be futile. The echoes of Alasia resonate far beyond ancient Gaul. Caesar's double walls became a blueprint for siegecraft, studied by generals from Napoleon to Patton. And Vercingetorix's legacy is equally complex, a symbol of resistance in France, yet also a cautionary tale about the limits of unity. The tribes that joined him fractured under pressure, their alliances crumbling when it mattered most. It's a reminder that last stands aren't just about courage, they're about cohesion. Without it, even the mightiest walls can't hold. Now, shift the scene from land to sea, where the stakes were just as high, but the battlefield was ever shifting. Naval last stands carried their own unique horrors, no fortresses to retreat to, just the endless, unforgiving waves. Imagine the deck of a warship, slick with blood and seawater, as crews fought not just enemies, but the ocean itself. Here, surrender often meant drowning, and honor was measured in how long you could keep your bow above the tide. The narrow straits between Salamis and the Athenian coast churned with oars and panic as Persia's colossal fleet, over 1,000 ships strong, found itself ensnared in a trap of its own arrogance. It was the autumn of 480 BCE, and the fate of Greece hung on the wits of one man, Themistocles, the cunning Athenian leader who had lured the enemy into these confined waters. He knew what Xerxes' admirals refused to admit in open sea. Persia's numbers would crush them, but here, where the channels twisted like a labyrinth, their advantage became a liability. The Greek triremes, lighter and nimbler, darted between the towering Persian vessels, their bronze rams splintering hulls with surgical precision. oars tangled, ships collided, and the once proud armada began to devour itself in the chaos. This wasn't just a battle, it was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Themistocles had spent months baiting Xerxes, feeding his ego with false messages of Greek disarray. The Persian king, so confident of victory, had even set up a throne on the cliffs to watch his triumph. Instead, he witnessed his navies unraveling. The Greeks fought with the desperation of those defending more than territory. They were safeguarding an idea. Athens, though evacuated, represented the fragile spark of democracy, a system Persia's autocracy sought to extinguish. Every splintered hull, every drowned sailor, was a blow against empire. The trireme itself became the hero of Salamis. These sleek warships, powered by the sweat and discipline of 170 rowers, turned the straits into a killing ground. Imagine the cacophony, the drumbeat setting the oars' rhythm, the shouts of coxswains, the sickening crunch of wood meeting wood. Persian ships, built for open water intimidation, floundered in the tight space. Their marines, elite fighters on land, were useless as the Greeks exploited their mobility, ramming and retreating like wolves harrying a cornered stag. By dusk, the sea was a graveyard of shattered timber and drowning men. Xerxes, watching from his perch, reportedly wept. Salamis echoes through naval history as a blueprint for asymmetric victory. Centuries later, admirals from Isan Sin in Korea to John Paul Jones in the American Revolution would replicate Themistocles' gambit using narrow waters to neutralize superior numbers. But perhaps its deepest legacy lies in what it preserved. Persia's defeat bought Athens time to flourish, to nurture the philosophies and governance that would shape Western thought. Had the Greeks lost, the world might never have known the age of Pericles, the tragedies of Sophocles, or the dialogues of Plato. Yet Salamis also reveals a paradox of last stands. They're rarely fought by those with nothing to lose. The Greeks had everything at stake: their homes, their fledgling democracy, their very identity. That's what fueled their fury, their precision, their refusal to yield. When the smoke cleared, the straits bore witness to a truth as old as warfare itself. Geography can be a weapon, but only if wielded by hearts unbroken. Now, shift from the salt-stained decks of Salamis to another kind of defiance, one etched not in waves, but in stone. High in the Andes, a different empire would face its own moment of reckoning, where the last free Incas turned mountain peaks into fortresses and legend into resistance. The rugged hills of northern Spain hid a secret Rome couldn't crush for 2 decades: Numantia, a fortress city of the Celtiberians, where defiance became an art. By the year 133 BCE, the Republic had thrown armies at this stubborn stronghold, only to watch them falter against guerrilla tactics and sheer grit. But Rome had a weapon more relentless than legions: Scipio Aemilianus, the same general who had razed Carthage. Fresh from obliterating one enemy of the Republic, he arrived at Numantia with a chilling reputation and a playbook of annihilation. What unfolded was less a siege than a slow strangulation. Scipio encircled the city with 7 miles of trenches and palisades, cutting off even the hope of escape. His engineers diverted rivers to deny the Numantines water, while patrols ensured no food slipped through. For 8 grueling months, the Celtiberians endured eating leather, boiling grass, and drinking rainwater scooped from holes in the ground. Yet they refused to kneel. When Scipio finally offered terms, their response echoed across history. They would rather die free than live as slaves. The end was both tragic and eerily familiar. Like Masada centuries later, Numantia chose collective suicide over surrender. Homes burned as families perished together, some by blade, others by poison. The few who hesitated reportedly leaped into the flames rather than face Roman chains. When Scipio's troops marched in, they found only smoldering ruins and silence. It was Carthage's nightmare repeated, another civilization erased, another lesson in Rome's unforgiving calculus of power. Yet Scipio, the destroyer of cities, seemed haunted by his victories. Ancient sources claim he wept at both Carthage and Numantia, quoting Homer as if mourning the cost of empire. Was it guilt or theatrical sorrow for the historians? The duality of his legacy fascinates. A man who praised Greek culture while obliterating cultures, who understood the poetry of loss even as he engineered it. Numantia's stand left scars on Rome's conscience. Later writers like Seneca held it up as a mirror, asking if such brutality was truly strength. The Celtiberians had no monuments, no historians to record their side, yet their defiance seeped into legend. Spanish painters and playwrights resurrected their story centuries later, turning them into symbols of national resistance. Even today, Numantino in Spanish means stubborn resilience, a linguistic ghost of that last unbroken will. This wasn't just a military defeat, it was a collision of worldviews. Rome saw surrender as pragmatic, an opportunity to integrate the conquered. But for tribes like the Celtiberians, freedom wasn't negotiable. Their choice, death before dishonor, forced Rome to confront the limits of its power. You could raise a city, but not the idea it died for. Numantia proved that some fires, once lit, refused to be extinguished. As the smoke cleared over Spain, another empire was preparing its own last stand far to the east, where Parthian horse archers would teach Rome a different kind of lesson, one written in the dust of a desert near Carrhae. But that's a story of arrows, not flames, and a reminder that defiance wears many faces. The Catalonian plains in 451 CE were not a place anyone would choose for a last stand, open ground, rolling and exposed, where cavalry could run unchecked. Yet here, beneath a brooding summer sky, Attila the Hun faced something unprecedented, an alliance of enemies who had, for once, stopped fighting each other to face him. Rome's general Flavius Aetius, the last great strategist of the fading empire, stood shoulder to shoulder with Theodoric, king of the Visigoths, a people who had spent decades sacking Roman cities. It was an uneasy partnership forged in sheer terror of the scourge of God. Attila had swept across Europe like a wildfire, leaving smoldering cities and shattered armies in his wake. His horde, a swirling mass of horse archers and Germanic auxiliaries, seemed unstoppable until the plains of Champagne became his stumbling block. The battle that followed was chaos incarnate. Jordanes, the Gothic historian, paints a scene of apocalyptic fury, rivers of blood turning the fields to mud, corpses piled so high they became obstacles. Theodoric, leading a cavalry charge, was thrown from his horse and trampled, his death sending shockwaves through his men. Yet instead of breaking, the Visigoths fought harder, hissing his name like a battle cry. By nightfall, the Huns had retreated to their wagon fort, their aura of invincibility cracked. But was this really the battle that saved Europe? The truth is messier than the legend. Attila wasn't destroyed at Catalonian plains. He slipped away to ravage Italy the next year. What the battle did prove was that coalitions could work briefly. Aetius, the architect of this fragile victory, would be murdered by his own emperor within years, a reward for saving a rotting empire. Theodoric's son would turn on Rome, sacking it just decades later. The real legacy of Catalonian lies not in halting the Huns, but in revealing how desperation can rewrite alliances overnight. The field itself became a grim monument. For centuries, locals called it the Camp of the Dead, avoiding the earth where bones still surfaced after heavy rains. Modern archaeology has found little, no mass graves, no Hun artifacts, just whispers in the soil. Perhaps that's fitting. The battle's importance was never about territory, it was about psychology. For the first time, someone had made Attila blink. That fragile hope that even the darkest tides can be slowed rippled across a trembling continent. Yet the savior narrative obscures a darker truth. Europe wasn't saved, it was reshaped. The Visigoths, Ostrogoths, and Vandals would finish what the Huns started, dismantling Roman authority piece by piece. Catalonian wasn't an ending, it was a rehearsal for the chaos to come, a fleeting moment when old enemies glimpse the price of division. And in that, it holds up a mirror to our own fractured world, where threats loom, and unity is always, achingly, just out of reach. The volcanic slopes of Shiroyama in 1877 became the stage for one of history's most poignant last stands, a twilight charge where swords met rifles, and an era died with the men who refused to let it go. Seigo Takamori, once a loyal general of the Meiji Emperor, now stood as the leader of a rebellion against the very modernization he'd helped unleash. His samurai, outnumbered 10-1, crouched behind makeshift barricades as imperial troops tightened the noose. These weren't just soldiers, they were the last guardians of Bushido, the warrior code that had shaped Japan for centuries. And as dawn broke on September 24th, they knew one truth with absolute clarity. This would be their final sunrise. What made Shiroyama so devastatingly cinematic wasn't just the mismatch of steel against bullets, it was the symbolism. The Meiji Restoration had ripped Japan from feudalism into the industrial age, dissolving samurai privileges, replacing katana with conscript armies. Seigo, ironically, had championed these reforms before witnessing their cost, a society unmoored from its soul. His rebellion wasn't just political, it was a protest against the death of honor itself. When his remaining 400 men fixed their white headbands and charged downhill into a hail of Gatling gunfire, they weren't expecting victory. They were etching their defiance into history's memory. Eyewitness accounts describe Seigo, wounded in the thigh and unable to stand, committing seppuku under a fusillade of shots, a ritual end for a man caught between two worlds. The parallels to other warrior castes' last stands are haunting. Like the Spartans at Thermopylae, the samurai chose a death that would outlive them. Like the knights of medieval Europe facing gunpowder at Agincourt, they clung to a code rendered obsolete by technology, but Shiroyama stands apart in its intimacy. This wasn't a distant clash of empires, it was a civil war, brother against brother. Many imperial officers had trained under Seigo, some reportedly wept as they gave the order to fire. The tragedy here wasn't just the fall of the samurai, but the inevitability of it. No amount of courage could stop progress's tide. Yet in their defeat, Seigo's rebels won something unexpected: immortality. The Japanese government, eager to unify the nation, later rehabilitated Seigo as a tragic hero, his statue erected in Tokyo as a symbol of loyalty. Bushido, far from dying, was romanticized into Japan's national spirit, repurposed for a modern age. Even the charge at Shiroyama became legend, inspiring films and ballads. It's a recurring paradox of last stands: the losers often shape history more than the victors. The samurai's end wasn't an erasure, it was a transformation. Their ideals, stripped of feudal trappings, seeped into Japan's DNA, proving that some codes are too resilient to disappear. As the smoke cleared over Shiroyama, the world turned another page. Swords gave way to steam engines, castles to factories. But the echoes of that charge linger, a reminder that progress always demands its sacrifices, and that those who resist it sometimes define its soul. The great walls of Constantinople had stood unbroken for 1,000 years, defying emperors and barbarians alike. But on May 29, 1453, the impossible happened. Sultan Mehmed II's cannons, monstrous creations that took 60 oxen to transport, had hammered the Theodosian walls for weeks, crumbling towers that once seemed eternal. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine XI knew the numbers were hopeless: 7,000 defenders against 80,000 Ottomans. Yet when the final assault came at dawn, he didn't hide behind palace doors. Clad in purple robes, sword in hand, he fought shoulder to shoulder with Venetian mercenaries and Greek monks on the shattered ramparts, turning every breach into a slaughterhouse. The Ottomans poured through a forgotten side gate left ajar, their banners flooding the streets like a crimson tide. Eyewitnesses described Constantine tearing off his imperial insignia to fight as a common soldier, his final moments lost in the chaos. Some say he fell defending a city gate, others claim he charged alone into a sea of janissaries. His body was never found, fueling legends that he sleeps beneath Constantinople's streets, waiting to reclaim his throne. What's certain is that Mehmed, upon entering Hagia Sophia, paused beneath its soaring dome. Staring at the mosaics of Christ Pantocrator, he reportedly murmured, "What a city we have given over to plunder and destruction." Even the conqueror felt the weight of history in that moment. Constantinople's fall wasn't just a military defeat, it was the extinguishing of Rome's last flickering candle. The city had been the living bridge between antiquity and the Renaissance, its libraries preserving Plato and Aristotle while Europe languished in the Dark Ages. Now those treasures scattered like ashes in the wind, some carried to Italy by fleeing scholars, others lost forever. Mehmed, paradoxically, became both destroyer and heir. He adopted the title Caesar of Rome, restored the Hagia Sophia as a mosque, and repopulated the city as Istanbul, a phoenix rising from Byzantine ruins. The siege tactics still fascinate military historians. Mehmed's genius lay in his fusion of old and new medieval siege towers alongside cutting-edge gunpowder, naval blockades combined with underground sapper tunnels. Yet Constantinople's defenders matched ingenuity with desperation, using makeshift repairs and Greek fire to hold the line for 53 days. The irony is profound. The walls that had repelled Attila and the Arabs finally fell to technology, marking the end of an era where stone alone could safeguard civilizations. East of Constantinople, other last stands would unfold as the Ottomans expanded Serbian knights at Kosovo, Albanian rebels in Kruja, but none carried the symbolic weight of 1453. This was more than a battle. It was the moment the medieval world gasped its last breath, and the modern age, for better or worse, began. The echoes of that Tuesday morning still resonate wherever empires rise and fall, reminding us that even the mightiest walls are only as strong as the wills that guard them. The windswept plains of Taulas in 751 CE might seem an unlikely place for a battle that would ripple across continents, but here, beneath the jagged peaks of Central Asia, two empires collided in a clash that quietly reshaped the world. The Abbasid Caliphate, fresh from toppling the Umayyads, was pushing east. The Tang dynasty, at the height of its power, stretched its influence west along the Silk Road. When their forces met near the Taulas River, neither side realized this would become a turning point not just for territory, but for the flow of knowledge itself. What made Taulas extraordinary wasn't just the scale of the fighting, though with estimates of over 100,000 soldiers, it was certainly colossal. It was the betrayal that tipped the scales. The Tang army, led by General Gao Xianji, relied heavily on Karluk mercenaries, Turkic warriors from the steppes. Midway through the battle, the Karluks switched sides, encircling their former allies in a devastating pincer move. The Tang lines shattered, their westward expansion halted forever. Yet the real legacy of Taulas lay not in the bodies left on the field, but in the secrets carried away by Abbasid captives, the art of papermaking. Within decades, Baghdad scholars were transforming Chinese techniques into an industrial-scale revolution. Paper mills sprang up across the Islamic world, preserving Greek philosophy, Persian poetry, and Indian mathematics while Europe still scratched on parchment. Imagine the irony. A military defeat for China became a cultural earthquake for the Abbasids, fueling the Islamic Golden Age. Tollers proves that last stands aren't always about holding ground. Sometimes losing a battle can win a war of ideas. Compare this to other culture-shaping clashes. At Tours in 732, Charles Martel's Franks halted the Umayyad advance into Europe, preserving Christendom's foothold. At Tollers, the opposite happened. The Abbasids didn't just stop the Tang, they absorbed their technology. It's a reminder that empires aren't just built on swords, but on the silent trade of knowledge. The Karluks, often forgotten in the grand narrative, became accidental midwives of history. Their defection didn't just change a battle's outcome, it rerouted the Silk Road's intellectual traffic for centuries. The Tang never fully recovered their Western ambitions, retreating into internal strife. The Abbasids, meanwhile, turned paper into a weapon far more enduring than steel. Scrolls from Baghdad would eventually reach Europe, helping spark the Renaissance. Tollers, then, is a paradox, a last stand where the real victory wasn't claimed on the battlefield, but in the quiet rustle of pages, in the ink-stained hands of scribes who didn't know they were rewriting history. Some defeats are merely delayed victories in disguise. The canals of Tenochtitlan ran red in the summer of 1521, not just with blood, but with the shattered reflections of a civilization in its death throes. For 80 days, the Aztec Emperor Cuauhtémoc, his name meaning descending eagle, had turned his island city into a labyrinth of resistance against Hernán Cortés and his allied forces. This wasn't just a siege, it was the collision of two worlds where steel met obsidian, and smallpox stalked the streets like an invisible conqueror. The Aztecs fought with the desperation of those who had seen their gods abandoned, their temples defiled, and their people decimated by disease. Yet every street, every canal became a kill zone, as Cuauhtémoc's warriors used their intimate knowledge of the floating city to ambush the invaders, dragging Spaniards into the water to drown beneath the weight of their own armor. Cortés, ever the strategist, had dismantled his own ships to build portable brigantines, turning Tenochtitlan's greatest defense, its watery moat, into a highway for his cannons. But the real weapon was biological. Smallpox, introduced months earlier by an infected slave, had ravaged the city, killing perhaps a third of its population, including Cuauhtémoc's predecessor. The stench of death hung thick, yet the Aztecs refused to yield. When Spanish forces finally breached the central plaza, they found starving defenders gnawing on roots and bark, their bodies covered in sores, yet still hurling stones from rooftops. Cuauhtémoc's final act was to flee by canoe, allegedly carrying what remained of the imperial treasure, only to be captured and tortured, a humiliating end that still sparks debate today. Was Tenochtitlan's fall inevitable? Some historians argue the empire was already fracturing, its tributary states eager to revolt under Aztec rule. The Tlaxcalans, traditional enemies of the Aztecs, formed the backbone of Cortés's army, outnumbering the Spanish 10-1. Others see betrayal in these alliances, indigenous groups unaware they were trading one master for another. But Cuauhtémoc's defiance complicates the narrative. Unlike Moctezuma, who initially welcomed Cortés as a god, Cuauhtémoc never wavered. His resistance, though futile, became a cornerstone of Mexican identity, a symbol of indigenous pride that would echo through centuries of colonial rule. The aftermath was a study in erasure. Tenochtitlan's temples were dismantled stone by stone to build Mexico City's cathedral, its canals filled with rubble. Yet resilience flickered in unexpected ways. Nahuatl scribes secretly recorded their history on codices hidden from Spanish eyes. Traditional healers blended herbal remedies with Catholicism, preserving knowledge under the guise of saints' miracles. Even Cuauhtémoc's legend grew, morphing from a defeated ruler into a martyr for sovereignty, his face now stamped on pesos and murals, his name invoked by Zapatista rebels in the 1990s. Tenochtitlan's fall wasn't just the end of an empire, it was the birth of a hybrid world. The same lakes that once protected the city now lie buried beneath modern streets, but their memory lingers in every taco stand using ancestral corn varieties, every Dia de los Muertos altar honoring the dead. Cuauhtémoc's stand, though grounded in military defeat, became a cultural victory, proof that some fires, even when doused, leave embers that never fully die. From the ashes of Mesoamerica, we turn to another empire's twilight, one where the battlefield wasn't a lake, but a frozen river, and the defenders weren't warriors, but ice-bound sailors facing a slow, grinding doom. The Franklin expedition's last stand in the Arctic would test the limits of human endurance, where the enemy wasn't an army, but the indifferent cruelty of nature itself. The jagged peaks of the Pyrenees loomed like silent sentinels as Charlemagne's army trudged homeward in the summer of 778, their campaign in Spain cut short by rebellion. The rearguard, led by Count Roland, trailed behind the main force, unaware that the narrow pass of Roncevaux was about to become the stage for one of history's most embellished last stands. The truth, buried beneath layers of medieval propaganda, is far stranger than the legend. Forget the Saracen hordes of the Song of Roland. The attackers were likely Basque mountaineers, local warriors defending their homeland from Frankish incursions. These weren't faceless invaders. They were shepherds and hunters who knew every crevice of these mountains, using guerrilla tactics to ambush Roland's heavily armored knights in terrain where cavalry was useless. The Song of Roland, penned centuries later, transformed this skirmish into a cosmic clash of civilizations. Roland, portrayed as the perfect Christian knight, blows his oliphant horn too late for help, then fights to the death against impossible odds. His sword, Durendal, supposedly contains relics of saints, a divine weapon for a holy war. But this epic wasn't history, it was political theater. Charlemagne's heirs needed a myth to justify crusades, to turn a military blunder into a martyrdom. The real Roland, just one of many nobles who died that day, his stand likely a desperate retreat rather than a heroic sacrifice. Archaeology hints at the battle scale. No mass graves have been found, suggesting casualties were modest by medieval standards. The Basques, far from the villainous horde of legend, vanished after their hit-and-run strike, leaving no boastful records. Their victory was pragmatic, not poetic, a reminder that empires often stumble not on grand battlefields, but in forgotten valleys where local knowledge trumps imperial might. Roncevaux's legacy is a lesson in how last stands are remembered versus how they happened. The Song of Roland became Europe's first great chants and digest, inspiring knights for generations. Yet the Basques, the actual victors, were erased from their own story, their role reduced to a footnote in Frankish propaganda. It's a pattern we've seen before. Winners write history, but losers sometimes write the legends. From the Pyrenees, the concept of the chivalric last stand would seep into medieval Europe's soul. The Crusades, the 100 Years' War, even the doomed charge of the Teutonic Knights at Grunwald, all drew power from Roland's myth. But behind every epic poem, there's a Roncevaux, a messy truth where heroes are human, and the enemy is often just someone else's defender. The pass still winds through the mountains today, quiet now, its stones holding secrets no song could ever fully capture. Now shift eastward to another mountain stand, where the stakes were even higher. and the defenders had no poets to immortalize them. The cliffs of Masada awaited, and with them, a last stand that would become a modern rallying cry. But that's a story where archaeology and ideology collide in ways even Roland's legend couldn't foresee. The walls of Acre groaned under the relentless pounding of Mamluk trebuchets, their stones trembling like a dying man's last breaths. It was the spring of 1291, and the last great Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land was unraveling hour by hour. Inside the city, a patchwork of Templars, Hospitallers, and desperate civilians braced for the inevitable. They knew this wasn't just a siege, it was the funeral pyre of 2 centuries of Crusader dreams. Sultan al-Ashraf Kollul's army had brought something new to the art of war. Massive counterweight trebuchets dubbed the Furious and the Victorious, hurling stones so heavy they could collapse entire towers in a single strike. But the real weapon was time. The Mamluks had learned patience, encircling Acre with methodical precision, choking its supply lines until even the rats grew scarce. What made Acre's fall so haunting wasn't just the military defeat, it was the unraveling of a worldview. For generations, European knights had sailed east believing God favored their cause. Now, as the Mamluks tunneled beneath the walls and Greek fire rained from the skies, that certainty crumbled faster than the mortar. The Templars, those legendary warrior monks, fought with cold precision, their swords flashing in the smoke-choked alleys. Eyewitness accounts describe the Grand Master, Guillaume de Beaujeu, bleeding out in the arms of his brothers, whispering, "I die as I lived, a faithful servant of Christ." His body was left where it fell, trampled underfoot as the Mamluks poured through the breaches. The aftermath was a study in contrasts. While the Mamluks systematically demolished Acre's churches and palaces, erasing Crusader footprints, they showed unexpected mercy to survivors, a stark departure from the bloodbaths of earlier sieges. Women and children were ransomed, artisans were spared for their skills. This wasn't mere pragmatism, it was a calculated message. The Mamluks weren't barbarians sacking a city. They were architects of a new order, proving their dominance through control, not just carnage. Compare Acre to other religious last stands, and the parallels sting. Like the Zealots at Masada, the Templars chose martyrdom over surrender. Like the Sikhs at Chamkaur, they turned a fortress into a symbol. But Acre stands apart in its historical weight. This wasn't just the end of a battle, it was the closing of an epoch. Within months, the remaining Crusader outposts Tyre, Sidon, Beirut fell like dominoes. The dream of Outremer, the Crusader kingdom, evaporated like morning mist over the Mediterranean. Yet in their collapse, the Crusaders left an unexpected legacy. The Mamluks, wary of future invasions, poured resources into fortifications that would later stall the Ottomans. European merchants, barred from the Levant, sought new routes east, planting the seeds for the age of exploration. Even the Templars' demise birthed myths that would fuel conspiracy theories for centuries. The Siege of Acre proves a bitter truth. Sometimes, the echoes of a last stand outlived the cause it was fought for. The stones of Acre may have been scattered, but the stories of faith, folly, and futile courage refused to stay buried. The Plains of Mohawks baked under the August sun in 1526, the air thick with the metallic tang of impending slaughter. Hungary's King Louis II, barely 20 years old and thrust into a crown he never expected to wear, surveyed his patchwork army, a mix of Hungarian nobles, German mercenaries, and Balkan levies. Across the marshlands, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent's Ottoman force loomed, its janissaries a sea of white turbans and polished muskets. The Hungarians, outnumbered 3-1, had gambled everything on a desperate charge. What followed wasn't just a battle, it was a national funeral. Louis knights, weighed down by plate armor, sank into the boggy terrain as Ottoman cannon fire tore through their ranks. The king himself, fleeing the carnage, tumbled from his horse into a stream, his heavy armor dragging him under. For days, no one knew his fate until a fisherman found his corpse, the royal seal still around his neck. That image, a drowned boy king in a muddy creek, became Hungary's defining trauma. Mohawks wasn't merely a defeat, it was the moment a kingdom ceased to exist as an independent power. The Ottomans carved up Hungary like a feast, while the Habsburgs swooped in to claim the western remnants, citing Louis' marriage alliance with their dynasty. Yet Mohawk's true legacy lies in its ripple effects. The battle shattered the medieval kingdom of Hungary, yes, but it also birthed something unexpected, the Habsburgs' eastern bulwark. For the next 2 centuries, Hungary became a battleground between Vienna and Constantinople, its plains scarred by fortresses like Eger and Chittorgarh, where other last stands would unfold. The Habsburgs, initially seen as opportunistic heirs, gradually reframed themselves as Christendom's shield against the Ottoman tide, a narrative built on Mohawk's ruins. Archaeology tells a grimmer story than the chronicles. Mass graves near the battlefield reveal bodies stacked like firewood, many with telltale arrow wounds or decapitations. Ottoman records boast of pyramids of skulls erected as victory markers, but dig deeper and you'll find quieter tragedies: a child's skeleton curled around a silver cross, a rusted spur still clinging to a nobleman's boot. These aren't just artifacts, they're silent witnesses to a day that rewrote Central Europe's map. Mohawks also exposes the fragility of dynastic luck. Louis' death without an heir triggered a succession crisis that reshaped the continent. Compare this to other royal last stands, Richard III at Bosworth or Harold Godwinson at Hastings, where a king's fall on the battlefield became the fulcrum of regime change. The difference: at Mohawks, the Ottomans didn't just kill a king, they erased a dynasty. The Jagiellonian line, which had ruled half of Europe from Lithuania to Bohemia, flickered out with Louis drowning. In its place rose the Habsburgs, masters of realpolitik, who turned tragedy into territory. What makes Mohawks unforgettable isn't the tactics or the troop counts. It's the symbolism, a kingdom's hopes literally sinking beneath the weight of its own armor. Modern Hungarians still call catastrophic losses more than Mohawks, a phrase heavy with the weight of history. The battlefield, now a quiet meadow dotted with memorials, holds a lesson about the price of unprepared leadership and the cruel arithmetic of power. For all the talk of glory in last stands, Mohawks reminds us that sometimes the most enduring legacy is the void left behind. From the marshes of Hungary, we turn to another dynasty's twilight, not on a battlefield, but in a palace where the last Romanovs faced a very different kind of siege. Their story, like Louis, would become a national reckoning, but the weapons here weren't cannons or scimitars. They were whispers, betrayal, and the cold machinery of revolution. The scorching sands of Karbala shimmered under the relentless Mesopotamian sun in the year 680 CE, where a small band of fewer than 100 souls stood encircled by an army of thousands. At their center, Hussein ibn Ali, grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, faced an impossible choice: swear allegiance to the Umayyad Caliph Yazid, whose rule he viewed as corrupt and unjust, or hold fast to his principles knowing it meant annihilation. What unfolded over those 10 days in Muharram would become far more than a battle. It was a moral crucible that forged the very soul of Shia Islam. Hussein's stand wasn't about territory or power. It was a protest against the erosion of spiritual integrity, a refusal to let political might redefine divine truth. The Umayyad forces, commanded by Ibn Ziyad, had cut off access to the Euphrates, leaving Hussein's followers, including women and children, parched in the desert heat. Even as thirst cracked their lips, they rejected offers of safe passage in exchange for submission. On the 10th day, Ashura, Husain dressed in white burial shrouds, signaling his acceptance of fate. The final moments were etched in visceral detail by historians. His half-brother Abbas falling while trying to fetch water, his infant son Ali Asghar struck by an arrow, Husain himself battling on foot after his horse was wounded, until a spear to the chest ended his life. The survivors, including his sister Zainab, were taken captive to Damascus, a humiliation meant to extinguish their legacy. Instead, their voices grew louder in chains. The theological weight of Karbala cannot be overstated. For Shia Muslims, Husain's martyrdom became the ultimate act of resistance against tyranny, a template for suffering with purpose. Unlike military last stands focused on victory, Husain's was a triumph of ethics over survival. His death wasn't a defeat but a revelation, exposing the moral bankruptcy of his opponents. Annual commemorations, from mourning processions to passion plays known as Taziye, keep this narrative alive, transforming grief into a weapon against injustice. Even the desert itself became sacred. Soil from Karbala is used in Shia prayer stones, symbolizing how blood consecrated the earth. Parallels to other ethical last stands ripple through history. The Christian martyrs of Rome, the Sikh Guru Tegh Bahadur's execution for defending Hindus, even the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, all share Karbala's DNA, the powerless confronting the powerful, not to win but to witness. Yet Karbala stands apart in its cosmic resonance, where Thermopylae became a symbol of martial pride and Masada a nationalist rallying cry. Husain's sacrifice transcends politics. It's a lodestar for anyone who's ever stood alone for what's right, knowing the cost. The Umayyads, for all their might, couldn't have imagined the irony. Their attempt to erase dissent birthed a tradition that outlasted their dynasty. Today, over 14 centuries later, millions still gather to weep for Husain, not as a fallen warrior, but as a beacon of conscience. Karbala proves that some battles aren't fought with swords, but with memory, and that the truest last stands are those that never truly end. The arid plains of Badr stretched endlessly under the merciless Arabian sun in the year 624, where 300 ill-equipped believers faced down a Meccan force 3 times their size. This wasn't just a battle, it was the moment Islam's survival hung by a thread. Prophet Muhammad's followers, exiled from Mecca and starving in Medina, had intercepted a caravan to reclaim stolen wealth. But when Abu Sufyan's 1,000-strong army arrived to crush them, the Muslims found themselves cornered between faith and annihilation. What happened next would become legend. Badr defies every expectation of a last stand. Unlike the Spartans or Masada's rebels, Muhammad's victory wasn't about heroic sacrifice, it was about improbable triumph. Islamic sources describe divine winds scattering Meccan ranks, angels fighting alongside the faithful, and the Prophet hurling handfuls of dust that blinded enemies. Skeptics dismiss these as myth, but the core truth remains. A ragtag band of believers routed a superior force through sheer conviction. The leadership lessons here are timeless. Muhammad's preparation was meticulous. He chose the battlefield for its wells, positioned his men with the sun at their backs, and inspired them with a vision beyond survival. When the Meccan champion Utbah challenged the Muslims to single combat, Muhammad sent forth his uncle Hamza, whose victory set the tone for the day. Compare Badr to later Islamic last stands, and the contrast is striking. At Karbala, Husain's martyrdom became a moral victory in defeat. At Cordoba's fall, the Umayyads' legacy persisted through culture, not swords. Badr, though, was the underdog's blueprint, proof that numbers and arms aren't everything. The Quran immortalized it as the day of distinction, when truth separated from falsehood. Yet the battle's aftermath reveals deeper layers. Muhammad spared prisoners who could teach Muslims to read, turning vengeance into enlightenment. The Meccans, humiliated but not destroyed, would fight again, but Badr had already shifted the balance of power in Arabia. What makes Badr resonate across centuries isn't just the tactics or the miracles. It's the psychology of the underdog. From David and Goliath to the American Revolution, history's greatest upsets share Badr's DNA. A smaller force leveraging terrain, morale, and audacity to defy the odds. The Prophet's victory wasn't just military, it was narrative. By framing the battle as a divine test, he transformed desperation into destiny. Modern leaders still study Badr not for its supernatural elements, but for its masterclass in turning weakness into strength. When the Meccans fled, they left behind not just bodies, but something far more dangerous to oppressors everywhere: the idea that the powerless could win. From the sands of Arabia, the theme of unlikely victories would echo through time, sometimes as faith, sometimes as sheer grit, but always as a reminder that history's scales can tip in a single, defiant moment. The fields of Watling Street in 61 CE were not just a battleground, they were a slaughterhouse, where the dreams of British liberation met the cold precision of Roman steel. Boudica, the flame-haired queen of the Iceni, had raged across Roman Britain like a wildfire, her rebel army burning Londinium to the ground and massacring tens of thousands. But here, on this unremarkable stretch of road, Governor Suetonius Paulinus waited with just 10,000 legionaries, his men chosen not for numbers but for discipline. What followed wasn't a battle, it was a massacre in reverse. The Romans, arrayed in a narrow defile with forest at their backs, used their short swords and shield wall to carve through Boudica's chaotic horde. The Britons, packed too tightly to swing their long swords, fell like wheat before the scythe. Ancient sources claim 80,000 rebels died that day, their bodies left to rot where they fell. Boudica herself fled, but not for long. The question of her suicide lingers like smoke after a pyre. Did she take poison to avoid capture, as Tacitus claims? Or did she succumb to wounds, as Cassius Dio suggests? History judges such acts harshly or kindly depending on who writes it. For the Romans, her death was the coward's way out, a barbarian queen who dared defy Rome and paid the price. For the Britons, it was the ultimate defiance, denying the empire the spectacle of her execution. Compare her to other warrior queens, Zenobia of Palmyra, who walked golden chains through Rome as a captive trophy, or the Trung sisters of Vietnam, whose river suicide became a national symbol. Boudica's end sits somewhere between neither triumphant nor wholly tragic, but undeniably iconic. Watling Street's legacy is a lesson in asymmetry. The Romans didn't win through bravery or numbers. They won because they turned the rebels' greatest strength, their fury, into a weakness. Boudica's army was vast but undisciplined, her tactics rooted in shock and terror. Against the cool, mechanical efficiency of Roman combat, rage meant nothing. The battlefield itself tells the story. Archaeologists have found no mass graves, no relics of a grand last stand. Just the quiet earth, holding secrets of a revolt that nearly changed history, but instead became a cautionary tale about the limits of passion against systemized power. Yet Boudica's ghost refused to stay buried. Elizabethan playwrights resurrected her as a proto-Protestant rebel against Rome's tyranny. Victorian poets painted her as a mother avenging her violated daughters. Modern nationalists, feminists, even punk bands have claimed her as their own. The irony is rich. A woman erased by Rome became immortal precisely because Rome recorded her defeat. Watling Street wasn't the end of her story. It was the first page of her myth, and in that she achieved what no sword could. She outlasted the empire that sought to break her. From the blood-soaked dirt of Britain, we turn to a different kind of defiance, one not of armies, but of ideas. In the deserts of Arabia, a different last stand was brewing, where faith would prove as sharp as any blade. But that's a story where the battlefield was the human heart, and the stakes were eternity itself. The harbor of Syracuse shimmered under the Sicilian sun in 213 BCE, its waters hiding deadly secrets. For over a year, this Greek city-state had defied Rome's mighty siege engines, not with brute force, but with the boundless imagination of one man, Archimedes. The aging mathematician, often so lost in thought he forgot to eat, had transformed Syracuse's defenses into a nightmare of innovation. When Roman galleys approached, massive cranes swooped down like metal herons, plucking ships from the water and smashing them against cliffs. Mirrors angled to focus sunlight into burning beams set sails ablaze. Even the city's walls hid catapults calibrated with geometric precision, their range adjusted by pulleys and counterweights mathematics made lethal. Marcellus, the Roman general, reportedly laughed when he first heard of these inventions, but his amusement turned to awe as his fleet was reduced to splinters by what seemed like sorcery. "Why do we fight this geometer?" he asked, "who uses our ships as his playthings?" The irony was exquisite. Rome, the empire of roads and legions, humbled by a man who saw the world in equations. Archimedes' genius wasn't just in inventing, it was in reimagining war itself. Where others saw walls, he saw levers. Where they saw ships, he saw problems of buoyancy waiting to be weaponized. His defenses turned Syracuse into a labyrinth of calculated terror, proving that intellect could stall even the mightiest war machine. Yet for all his brilliance, Archimedes remained curiously detached from the conflict. Ancient historians paint him as indifferent to politics, consumed instead by the purity of his work. Plutarch tells of him sketching geometric figures in the sand as the city burned, murmuring theorems to himself while Roman swords flashed in the streets. When a soldier finally burst into his study, the legend claims Archimedes barely looked up, snapping, "Do not disturb my circles," a plea cut short by the blade that ended him. Whether fact or myth, the story crystallizes a haunting truth. Genius often outlives its protectors. Syracuse's fall marked more than just another Roman conquest. It was a collision between two worldviews. Marcellus, to his credit, recognized the loss. He ordered Archimedes buried with honors and hunted down the soldier who killed him. But the real tragedy wasn't the death of a man, it was the silencing of a mind that saw further than any of his time. Archimedes' unfinished scrolls, recovered centuries later, contained ideas that anticipated calculus and modern engineering. One can only wonder what else might have emerged had he lived to complete those interrupted thoughts. The siege also poses uncomfortable questions about the role of intellect in war. Archimedes' inventions delayed the inevitable but couldn't prevent it. Like the Enigma codebreakers of World War II or the Manhattan Project scientists, his story forces us to grapple with whether brilliance in service of conflict is ultimately liberating or futile. Syracuse's defenders fought with fire and steel. Archimedes fought with the immutable laws of physics. Both lost, yet his legacy, like those of other intellectual last, stands from the burning of the Library of Alexandria to Alan Turing's persecuted genius transcends victory or defeat. What endures is the image of a man tracing circles in the sand, oblivious to the chaos around him. In that moment, Archimedes embodied the eternal struggle of ideas against empires, of light against the gathering dark. His death wasn't just an ending, it was a beacon. For every thinker who's ever scribbled on a napkin or whispered an idea into the void, his stand at Syracuse whispers back, some truths are worth defending, even when the world is crumbling. And sometimes the most powerful last stands leave no monuments, just equations waiting to be solved. From the ashes of Syracuse, we turn to a different kind of resistance, where the battlefield wasn't a city but a courtroom, and the weapons weren't catapults but words. The trial of Socrates would prove that some last stands don't need walls to echo through millennia. The plains outside Adrianople simmered under the August heat in 378 CE, the air thick with dust and the metallic scent of impending disaster. Emperor Valens, eager for a swift victory after weeks of Gothic raids, had marched his elite Roman legions into a death trap. What awaited them wasn't just an enemy, it was a revolution in warfare. The Gothic horsemen, refugees turned rebels after years of Roman mistreatment, had spent months honing their tactics in the Balkans. Their cavalry didn't just flank Valens' infantry, they engulfed it like a wildfire, their heavy lances shattering formations that had dominated Europe for centuries. By nightfall, 2/3 of Rome's eastern army lay slaughtered, Valens himself missing, his body never found, leaving historians to wonder if he perished in the flames of a nearby farmhouse or vanished beneath the hooves of Gothic horses. Adrianople's true shock wasn't the defeat. Rome had lost battles before, but the seismic shift it revealed. For 500 years, the legion's disciplined infantry had been the empire's backbone. Now the future belonged to the horse. The Goths, though initially fleeing the Huns, had mastered the very mobility that would define medieval warfare. Their victory wasn't just tactical, it was generational. Compare this to Rome's earlier disasters like Cannae or Teutoburg Forest. Those were setbacks, not system failures. Adrianople cracked the myth of Roman invincibility, proving that even the empire's finest could be outmaneuvered by those they dismissed as barbarians. Valens' fatal miscalculation reads like a case study in imperial hubris, ignoring scouts' warnings of Gothic numbers, refusing to wait for reinforcements from his nephew Gratian in the west. He'd rushed into battle hungry for personal glory. Ancient sources paint him as impatient, jealous of Gratian's successes, and blind to the changing face of war. Yet the deeper tragedy lies in the Gothic perspective. These weren't invaders but desperate refugees, driven to rebellion after Roman officials starved their children and enslaved their elders. Their leader Fritigern had tried repeatedly to negotiate, only to be met with treachery or contempt. Adrianople, then, was as much a revolt of the oppressed as a military turning point. The battle's aftershocks rippled far beyond that blood-soaked field. Within decades, the Goths would carve out kingdoms inside Roman borders, their warriors becoming both the empire's destroyers and its reluctant heirs. Theodosius the Great, Valens' successor, had no choice but to grant them land and status, weaving the barbarians into Rome's unraveling fabric. Some historians mark Adrianople as the true start of the Middle Ages, the moment the old order began its irreversible collapse. Others see it as a symptom, not a cause, of an empire already rotting from within. Either way, the lesson echoes through history. No power, no matter how ancient, is immune to the tides of change. From the ashes of Adrianople, the road led inexorably to Rome's final reckoning, not in some distant frontier, but at the very heart of the empire. A century later, another Germanic leader would stand before the city's gates, not as a refugee, but as a conqueror. And this time, there would be no legions left to stop him. The dusty plains of Yarmouk stretched like a vast arena beneath the Syrian sun in 636 CE, where the fate of an empire would be decided not by numbers, but by sheer tactical genius. On one side stood the Byzantine army, a seasoned force bolstered by Armenian and Arab allies, their ranks bristling with heavy cavalry and armored cataphracts. Opposite them, Khalid ibn al-Walid's Muslim warriors outnumbered nearly 2 to 1. waited with the quiet confidence of men who had already defied the impossible. This wasn't just a battle, it was a masterclass in turning disadvantage into opportunity. Khalid, known as the Sword of Allah, had spent months studying the terrain, the wind patterns, even the psychology of his opponents. When the clash came, his maneuvers would rewrite the rules of desert warfare forever. The battle's opening moves reveal Khalid's brilliance. Instead of meeting the Byzantines head-on, he lured their cavalry into a series of feigned retreats, stretching their lines thin across the arid plateau. Then, at the critical moment, he unleashed his reserve cavalry in a hammer and anvil strike, crushing the Byzantine flanks against his own disciplined infantry. But the most enduring legend is the sandstorm, a swirling tempest said to have blinded the Byzantines at the decisive hour. Historians debate whether it was divine intervention or Khalid's keen understanding of seasonal winds, but the effect was undeniable. The Byzantines, already disoriented by Khalid's relentless repositioning, found themselves hacking at shadows as the Muslim forces closed in. By dusk, the empire's grip on Syria had evaporated, its survivors fleeing northward in disarray. Khalid's legacy at Yarmouk transcends the battlefield. Unlike the static warfare of Rome or Persia, his tactics embraced fluidity, exploiting mobility and morale over sheer mass. His use of mobile guard units, small, fast-moving detachments that could reinforce weak points, anticipated modern maneuver warfare by centuries. Compare this to other Arab conquest last stands, at Qadisiyah, where Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas used trench warfare to neutralize Persian elephants, or at Nahawand, where deception turned a Persian ambush into a rout. Khalid's genius lay in adapting to each challenge without sacrificing speed or surprise. Even his enemies acknowledged it. Byzantine chronicles grudgingly dubbed him the Dracula of the desert for his uncanny ability to appear where least expected. Yet Yarmouk's true significance lies in its ripple effects. The battle didn't just hand Syria to the Rashidun Caliphate. It shattered Byzantine prestige, emboldening other regions to switch allegiances. Within a century, Arab rule would stretch from Spain to the Indus. Khalid, though later sidelined by Caliph Umar, became immortalized in military lore, a figure whose name still evokes awe in staff colleges from Damascus to West Point. His story also underscores a recurring theme in last stands: the underdog's advantage. Like Hannibal at Cannae or Napoleon at Austerlitz, Khalid proved that victory often belongs not to the strongest army, but to the sharpest mind. From the dust of Yarmouk, the Arab conquest surged forward, but another empire's twilight loomed on the horizon, one where the last stand wouldn't unfold on open plains, but within the labyrinthine streets of a city clinging to its past. Constantinople's final agony would test not just swords, but the very soul of an era. The Tangut kingdom of Western Asia had survived for nearly 2 centuries along the Silk Road, its fortified cities and Tibetan-influenced Buddhism standing as a testament to resilience, until Genghis Khan rode south with a singular purpose. By 1227, the Mongols had already crushed the kingdom's armies, razed its northern strongholds, and left its farmlands salted. But the final act of this annihilation would become one of history's most chilling last stands, not for its military drama, but for its calculated brutality. As the Mongols breached the capital of Zhongsing, the Tangut royal family faced a fate worse than battlefield death. Every last heir, from infants to elders, was methodically executed, not in the heat of conquest, but as deliberate policy. The Tanguts weren't just defeated, they were erased from the record, their written language nearly lost to time, their temples reduced to rubble beneath the hooves of Mongol ponies. Was this genocide or cold strategy? The question lingers like smoke over a razed city. Genghis Khan had reasons beyond bloodlust. The Tanguts had betrayed him years earlier, withdrawing support during his campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire, a slight the Great Khan never forgave. Their elimination sent a message to future vassals: disloyalty meant extinction, yet the scale of destruction suggests something darker than mere pragmatism. Persian chronicler Juvayni wrote of entire towns left without even a dog to bark, while Chinese records describe mountains of bones bleaching in the sun. Modern scholars still debate whether this meets the definition of genocide, but the effect was undeniable. Western Xia vanished so thoroughly that its existence became a rumor until archaeology resurrected it centuries later. The Tangut last stand also reveals a paradox in Mongol warfare. Unlike the heroic defenses of Constantinople or Masada, where defenders became legends, the Tanguts' resistance was airbrushed from history by their conquerors. Even in defeat, most cultures leave echoes, songs, chronicles, martyrs. The Tanguts were denied even that, yet their destruction wasn't unique in the Mongol playbook. At Nishapur in Persia, every living creature, down to the cats, was slaughtered after the city rebelled. At Kiev, mothers reportedly threw their children into fires rather than face Mongol captivity. The Mongols understood that terror could be a weapon more potent than any siege engine. Fear traveled faster than their cavalry, softening resistance before they arrived. But link these horrors to other Mongol last stands, and a pattern emerges. When facing worthy foes, the Khan's army often showed perverse respect. The Jin dynasty's Kaju defenders fought so fiercely in 1234 that the Mongols granted them an honorable surrender. The Song loyalists at Diaoyu Castle held out for 36 years, so long that the Mongols eventually absorbed their tactics. The difference: those enemies fought openly, playing by the unspoken rules of steppe warfare. The Tanguts, in Genghis' eyes, had broken faith. Their last stand wasn't a battle, it was a lesson written in blood. The Western Xia's disappearance raises uncomfortable questions about how history remembers or forgets the defeated. We know Leonidas' name, but who recalls the Tangut generals who died on Zhongsing's walls? Their story, fragmented and half-lost, reminds us that not all last stands end in glory. Some vanish into silence, leaving only bones beneath the sand and whispers in the wind. And sometimes the most terrifying last stands aren't those where warriors fall fighting, but where an entire people are unmade with such efficiency that the world barely notices they're gone. From the ashes of Western Xia, the Mongols turned their gaze westward, where another empire, the Khwarezmian, would soon face its own reckoning. But that's a story where betrayal, once again, would ignite a fire too vast to contain. The fields of Grunwald simmered under the July sun in 1410, a stage set for the collapse of an empire built on faith and steel. The Teutonic Knights, Europe's most feared monastic order, faced an alliance they'd long dismissed as disorganized rabble. Poland and Lithuania, united under King W. Ladislaw Jagiello. What unfolded wasn't just a battle, it was the death rattle of a warrior brotherhood that had ruled the Baltic with an iron fist for centuries. The Teutons, clad in their signature white mantles emblazoned with black crosses, advanced with the confidence of men who'd never known defeat. But Jagiello had spent years studying their tactics, and his masterstroke would come from an unexpected source. A feigned retreat so perfectly executed it lured the knights into annihilation. As the Polish-Lithuanian cavalry suddenly broke formation, scattering in apparent panic, the Teutons couldn't resist the bait. Their Grand Master, Ulrich von Jungingen, ordered a reckless charge straight into a killing zone. Hidden infantry with hooked pikes rose from the tall grass, dragging knights from their saddles, while Lithuanian horsemen wheeled back to encircle them. The order's famed discipline shattered like glass under a hammer. By dusk, von Jungingen lay dead alongside 200 of his brothers, their bodies piled so high they formed grisly barricades. The defeat was so total that eyewitnesses described the nearby lakes running red for days, choked with the corpses of men and horses. Grunwald's aftermath reveals the fragility of warrior myths. The Teutonic Knights had built their legend on crusading zeal, converting pagans at sword point and ruling conquered lands with a blend of piety and brutality. Yet their rigid hierarchy, designed for holy war, couldn't adapt to shifting politics. When Poland and Lithuania Christianized, the order lost its moral justification but clung to its privileges, becoming little more than a mercenary state. Grunwald didn't just break their army, it exposed their irrelevance. Within decades, their territories would shrink to a rump state, their grand masters reduced to vassals. The battle also revolutionized medieval warfare. Jagiello's feigned retreat wasn't new. Mongols had used it for centuries, but its precision at Grunwald made it textbook. Later commanders from Wallenstein to Napoleon would study this moment, recognizing how psychology could trump armor. Yet the tragedy here runs deeper than tactics. The Teutons' fall mirrors other knightly last stands. The Burgundians at Nancy, the French heavy cavalry at Agincourt, even the Confederate charge at Gettysburg. Each represents a warrior caste confronting its obsolescence, their cherished codes undone by changing times. The knights at Grunwald didn't just die fighting, they died believing their way of war was eternal, only to discover history had moved on without them. What lingers isn't just the battle scale, over 50,000 combatants, making it one of medieval Europe's largest, but its cultural aftershocks. In Poland, Grunwald became a national founding myth, celebrated in art and song. For the Teutons, it was a wound that never fully healed, though they'd rebrand themselves centuries later as a charitable order. The field itself, now dotted with solemn monuments, whispers a cautionary tale about the price of hubris. The knights' white mantles, once symbols of divine favor, now lie buried in the soil, relics of an era when faith and violence walked hand in hand, until the day the world decided it no longer needed either. From the blood-soaked soil of Grunwald, the story of last stands shifts to another brotherhood facing extinction, not on open fields but in the misty highlands of Scotland. Here, clansmen would make their final charge not against armies, but against the relentless march of progress itself. The sandstone walls of Chittorgarh glowed crimson in the setting sun, not from the light of dusk, but from the flames consuming the fortress from within. In 1567, as Akbar's Mughal forces tightened their siege around this bastion of Rajput pride, the women and children of the court performed an act of defiance that would echo through centuries. Johar, the ritual mass suicide by fire. While the men donned saffron robes preparing for their final charge, their wives and daughters embraced a fate more unthinkable than death on the battlefield. Dressed in bridal finery, clutching their children, they walked singing into the pyres rather than face capture by the invaders. This wasn't just resistance, it was a statement written in ash and agony. Honor could not be conquered. Chittorgarh's tragedy unfolds in layers of cultural complexity. Unlike Western last stands focused on military valor, here, women's sacrifice became the ultimate act of warfare. The Rajput queens, led by Rani Padmini, though her historicity is debated, weren't passive victims. They orchestrated their own deaths as a strategic blow against Mughal dominance, denying Akbar the symbolic victory of assimilating them into his harem. Their Johar turned their bodies into weapons, transforming what the Mughals saw as spoils of war into a spiritual rebuttal. Compare this to other gendered last stands, the Viking women at Boudica who chose death over slavery, or the Jewish mothers at Masada who killed their children to spare them Roman brutality. Chittorgarh stands apart in its ritualized collective nature, a societal rebuke etched in fire. The fort itself looms as a silent witness to this defiance. Perched on a 500-foot hill, its 7 gates had repelled invaders for centuries, but Akbar's cannons, symbols of the New World Order, reduced its walls to rubble. Yet even in ruin, Chittorgarh retained its power. The Mughals could occupy the stone, but not the story. Today, the Tower of Victory built by Akbar stands ironically overshadowed by the Johar Memorial, where Rajput women are venerated as goddesses. The paradox is striking, a conqueror's monument forgotten, while the voices of those who burned echo in folk songs and festivals. This siege also forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about resistance and agency. Modern scholars debate whether Johar was empowerment or patriarchal coercion, a choice made by women or for them. The Rajput chronicles glorify it as the pinnacle of feminine duty, while feminist readings see a system that valorized death over survival. Contrast this with the Rani of Jhansi's later revolt against the British, where women fought with swords rather than flames. Both are celebrated as heroic, but only one allowed women to die as warriors, not wives. Chittorgarh wasn't an isolated event. It was the third and final sack of the fort, following similar sieges in 1303 and 1535. Each time the Johar ritual repeated, each pyre adding to the legend. Akbar, despite his reputation for tolerance, showed no mercy here, perhaps because the Rajputs' unyielding pride threatened his vision of a unified empire. Their defiance, though militarily futile, became a cultural rallying cry. Even today, Rajasthan's ballads recount the siege with a mix of grief and triumph. The names of queens like Padmini and Karnavati whispered like battle hymns. From the ashes of Chittorgarh, the Rajput spirit refused to be extinguished. Their descendants would later serve as Mughal generals, but always with a caveat: their loyalty came with unspoken terms. The fort's ruins, now an UNESCO site, attract pilgrims and tourists alike, all drawn to the haunting beauty of a place where loss and legacy intertwine. The stones seem to whisper that some defeats outlast victories, and some fires, once lit, never truly go out. The fog clung to the valleys of Sekigahara like a shroud on that fateful morning of October 21, 1600, as two massive samurai armies faced each other across the muddy fields of central Japan. This wasn't just a battle, it was the culmination of decades of betrayal, ambition, and a nation's soul hanging in the balance. On one side stood Tokugawa Ieyasu, the cunning warlord who'd spent a lifetime waiting for this moment. Opposite him, the Western army loyal to the Toyotomi clan, their ranks including the legendary Red Devils of Shima Saken, warriors so fierce their crimson armor struck terror into enemies. What unfolded over the next 6 hours would reshape Japan forever, not through heroic combat, but through a web of treachery so intricate it still leaves historians breathless. Ieyasu's victory wasn't won with swords alone. Hours before the clash, he'd secretly bribed key Western generals like Kobayakawa Hideki, whose forces sat atop a crucial hill neutral on paper, but poised to strike like a coiled serpent. When the battle reached its tipping point, Kobayakawa's betrayal unfolded with chilling precision. His samurai descended like an avalanche onto their former allies, while other turncoats flipped their banners mid-charge. The Red Devils fought with desperate valor, Shima Saken reportedly taking 15 arrows before falling, but even their legendary courage couldn't withstand the collapse of their own lines. By afternoon, the Western Army's resistance had crumbled into a rout, their leaders fleeing or committing seppuku in the blood-soaked rice paddies. What makes Sekigahara so mesmerizing isn't just the scale, 160,000 warriors clashing, but its legacy as the death knell of samurai autonomy. For centuries, these warrior lords had ruled their domains like kings, answering only to distant shoguns when it suited them. Ieyasu's victory centralized power like never before, paving the way for 250 years of Tokugawa rule where daimyo became glorified bureaucrats. The battle's aftermath was methodically brutal. Defeated lords saw their lands redistributed, their heirs erased, their castles dismantled. Even the Toyotomi clan, once Japan's de facto rulers, were reduced to a footnote before being exterminated at Osaka Castle 15 years later. This wasn't just a shift in leadership, it was the end of an era where personal honor could outweigh political pragmatism. Yet Sekigahara's echoes extend far beyond Japan. Like the Battle of Hastings or Gaugamela, it represents one of history's rare hinge points, a single day that irrevocably altered a civilization's trajectory. The Tokugawa peace that followed froze Japan's social order, stifling innovation but also preventing the constant warfare that had ravaged the islands for generations. When Commodore Perry's black ships arrived in 1853, they found a society preserved in amber, its samurai class hollowed out by centuries of enforced idleness. The irony is profound. The very battle that cemented samurai dominance also sowed the seeds of their obsolescence. The Red Devil's last stand takes on mythic dimensions in this light. Their doomed resistance symbolizes not just loyalty to the Toyotomi, but to a vanishing world where individual prowess could still sway empires. Compare them to other tragic holdouts, the Sikhs at Chamkaur, the Varangian Guard at Constantinople, warriors who fought knowing their cause was lost but their example eternal. Shima Sakon's legend grew so potent that Edo period kabuki plays portrayed him returning as a vengeful ghost, a spectral reminder that some debts of honor can't be paid with mere victory. Sekigahara's dirt still yields artifacts, broken arrowheads, rusted helmet fragments, even the occasional gold coin that might have been a bribe dropped in the chaos. These relics whisper of the human stakes behind the grand narratives. For every strategist like Ieyasu, there were thousands of Ashigaru foot soldiers who bled into that soil without understanding the larger game. That tension between individual courage and inexorable historical forces is what makes last stands so endlessly compelling. They force us to ask, when the fog of Sekigahara lifts, revealing the new world being born, who gets to decide what was worth dying for? From the misty valleys of Japan, we turn to a last stand that unfolded an ocean away, where another warrior culture faced its reckoning, not on a battlefield, but in the frozen hell of a Russian winter. The Swiss Guard's sacrifice at the Tuileries Palace would prove that even in the age of revolutions, some oaths outlive kingdoms. The morning of September 12, 1683, dawned with a tension so thick it seemed to choke the very air above Vienna. For 2 months, the city had endured the Ottoman siege, its starving defenders reduced to eating rats and boiling leather as Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa's forces tunneled beneath the walls. Then, just as the situation seemed hopeless, a glint of sunlight flashed from the Kollenberg heights. The Polish-Lithuanian winged hussars had arrived. Clad in gleaming armor with feathered wings arching from their backs, these cavalrymen weren't just soldiers. They were a psychological weapon, their very appearance designed to strike terror into enemy hearts. King Jan Sobieski, leading the largest cavalry charge in history, surveyed the Ottoman camp sprawled below like a vast, disorganized sea. With a whispered prayer, he gave the signal, and 20,000 horsemen began their descent. The charge unfolded with cinematic brutality. The hussars' lances, some 18 feet long, punched through Ottoman ranks like needles through silk, while their war cries mingled with the thunder of hooves. Kara Mustafa, confident in his numerical superiority, had failed to fortify his rear, assuming the wooded hills impassable. That arrogance proved fatal. Sobieski's forces didn't just attack, they unleashed a tempest of steel and momentum, rolling up the Ottoman flanks like a carpet. Within hours, the siege collapsed, the Grand Vizier fleeing in such haste he abandoned his treasure tents, including sacks of strange brown beans later identified as coffee. The battle's aftermath was a study in contrasts. Polish troops celebrated with captured Turkish pastries, unwittingly birthing the Viennese café culture that would fuel Europe's Enlightenment. But Vienna's salvation wasn't just a military triumph, it was a testament to fragile unity. The Holy League, an alliance of Catholic powers often at each other's throats, had set aside centuries of rivalry to face a common threat. The Habsburgs, Poles, and Germans fought side by side, their cooperation a rare moment of harmony in a fractured continent. Compare this to earlier failed alliances, like the disorganized Christian forces at Mohawks, and the difference is stark. Vienna proved that cultural survival sometimes demands setting aside old grudges, if only temporarily. The victory didn't just preserve Christendom, it redrew the map of Europe, marking the Ottomans' irreversible decline and the Habsburgs' rise as a continental power. Yet the battle's most enduring legacy might be the unlikeliest, the coffee bean. Ottoman sacks left behind in the rout were claimed by a Polish spy named Kulczycki, who opened Vienna's first coffee house, adding milk and honey to suit European palates. This accidental transfer symbolizes how last stands aren't just about destruction, they're also conduits for unexpected exchange. From the ashes of conflict, new traditions emerge. The Hussars' charge didn't merely save a city, it catalyzed a cultural shift, caffeinating the intellectual ferment of 18th century Europe. Vienna's stand resonates because it embodies a paradox. Sometimes the fiercest battles are fought not for conquest but for continuity. The defenders weren't protecting mere territory, they were safeguarding a way of life, just as the Aztecs did at Tenochtitlan or the Rajputs at Chittorgarh. Their victory ensured that Vienna's opera houses and salons would one day host Mozart and Freud, not the call to prayer. And in that, it offers a timeless lesson. Civilizations aren't remembered for their wars, but for what they preserve when the fighting ends. The winged hussars may have faded into history, but their charge echoes wherever cultures cling to light against the gathering dark. From the coffee houses of Vienna, we turn to a final stand where no armies clashed, but an entire people's future hung in the balance. The Cherokee Trail of Tears, a march not of defiance, but of survival against erasure. The sun beat down mercilessly on the rocky slopes of Isandlwana on January 22, 1879, where 20,000 Zulu warriors stood in eerie silence, their cowhide shields and short-stabbing spears glinting in the midday heat. Across from them, the British 24th Regiment lounged in their red coats, rifles stacked carelessly in neat rows, their commanders convinced the savage army wouldn't dare attack disciplined European troops. That arrogance would prove fatal when the Zulu impis finally surged forward in their traditional buffalo horns formation, younger warriors stretching the flanks while seasoned fighters hammered the center. The British lines shattered within minutes. Rifle volleys that should have mowed down charging forces instead fell short as Zulus used the terrain to creep within yards before exploding into close combat. The result was the worst defeat of a modern army by indigenous forces in the colonial era, over 1,300 British and Allied troops slaughtered in a single afternoon. What made Isandlwana so devastating wasn't just the Zulu tactics, but the perfect storm of British miscalculations. Officers had ignored basic defensive protocols, scattering their campsite across too wide an area without fortifications. Ammunition boxes were locked tight with screws, slowing reloading to a crawl as Zulus closed in. Some soldiers reportedly fought with bayonets against spears in hand-to-hand combat, their rifles useless once the enemy was inside their effective range. The Zulus, meanwhile, had adapted brilliantly to European technology. Warriors targeted officers first, recognizing their gold braid and swords to decapitate command structures. Others used the dead's own rifles against them, though unfamiliar with reloading. This wasn't a battle of primitive versus modern. It was a masterclass in how traditional warfare could exploit colonial complacency. The battle's aftermath reveals uncomfortable truths about imperial narratives. British accounts initially framed the disaster as a fluke, blaming everything from faulty ammunition to treasonous scouts. Yet Zulu oral histories describe meticulous planning by King Cetshwayo's generals, who'd studied British tactics during earlier skirmishes. The victory, though short-lived, became a beacon for anti-colonial movements worldwide. Compare Isandlwana to other indigenous triumphs, the Mahdists crushing General Gordon at Khartoum, the Boxers besieging foreign legations in Beijing, or the Sioux annihilating Custer at Little Bighorn. All share a common thread: imperial powers underestimating local knowledge and adaptability. The Zulus didn't win because they were fiercer. They won because they were smarter, turning British assumptions into vulnerabilities. Yet Isandlwana's legacy is bittersweet. The Zulu kingdom fell within months, its resources drained by the war's next phase. The battle's very success hardened British resolve, leading to scorched earth reprisals. Today, the battlefield's white stone cairns mark British mass graves, while Zulu dead honored in song and memory lie in unmarked pits. This duality haunts many anti-colonial last stands, tactical victories that become strategic defeats. The Zulus didn't just fight for territory, they fought for the right to define their own future. In that, Isandlwana's stones still whisper a warning that no empire, no matter how technologically advanced, is invincible to those fighting for home. From the dust of Isandlwana, we turn to a different kind of resistance, one where the last stand wasn't on a battlefield, but in the quiet defiance of a courtroom. The trial of Socrates would prove that some battles aren't fought with spears or rifles, but with questions that outlive empires. Dawn crept over the Alamo's crumbling adobe walls on March 6, 1836, casting long shadows across a courtyard where fewer than 200 defenders braced for annihilation. Inside, Jim Bowie lay feverish on a cot, his legendary knife untouched beside him, while Davy Crockett tuned his fiddle, perhaps for the last time. Outside, General Santa Anna's army, nearly 2,000 strong, loaded their bayonets and ladders, eager to crush this symbol of Texan defiance. What followed wasn't just a battle, it was the birth of an American myth, wrapped in so much legend that the truth often gets lost in the gun smoke. The Alamo's defenders were a messy mix of ideals and contradictions. Bowie, the land speculator turned folk hero, had arrived to dismantle the fort before switching sides to defend it. Crockett, the former congressman whose backwoods persona was partly a political stunt, came seeking a fresh start only to find himself cornered by history. Their ragtag force included Tohono ranchers, enslaved men fighting for masters who promised freedom, and adventurers lured by the romance of revolution. This wasn't the homogenized band of patriots later paintings would depict. It was a microcosm of the West's chaotic ambitions, where self-interest and idealism collided. Santa Anna's perspective, often overshadowed by Texan lore, reveals a different story. To Mexico, the Alamo wasn't a heroic last stand. It was an illegal garrison in sovereign territory, manned by squatters flouting Mexican laws, including the abolition of slavery. The general's decision to take no prisoners wasn't mere cruelty. It was a calculated message to other rebels. His troops, many conscripted indigenous soldiers with no love for their aristocratic commander, fought not out of malice but duty. When the final assault came at 5 a.m., The fighting was so close quarters that muskets became clubs, and the mission's chapel ran with blood. Eyewitness accounts from Mexican officers describe Crockett's body surrounded by slain attackers, suggesting a resistance fiercer than Santa Anna anticipated. The "Remember the Alamo" rallying cry, born from the massacre, glossed over uncomfortable truths. Sam Houston's army used the tragedy to recruit volunteers, spinning defeat into a narrative of martyrdom that fueled the decisive victory at San Jacinto 6 weeks later. Yet the battle's legacy is a Rorschach test of interpretation. For Anglo-Texans, it symbolized resistance to tyranny. For many Mexicans, it was a footnote in a larger struggle against American expansionism, one that would cost them half their territory. Even the Alamo's physicality is contested. The iconic facade we know today was a ruin for decades, rebuilt and reimagined to fit the myth. Link this to other revolutionary last stands and patterns emerge. Like the Spartans at Thermopylae, the Alamo's defenders knew they'd die but chose to fight for a cause larger than survival. Like Masada's rebels, their story was polished by the victors who came after. But what sets the Alamo apart is its commercialization, the way it's been packaged into movies, souvenirs, and political slogans. The real tragedy isn't just the lives lost, but how their complexity has been flattened into platitudes. The chapel's quiet today belies the noise of history. Walk its grounds, and you're not just tracing the footsteps of Crockett and Bowie, you're walking through layers of memory, each generation projecting its needs onto those crumbling walls. The Alamo endures not because it was strategically important, it wasn't, but because it asks us who gets to define courage, and who gets to write the stories we live by. Some last stands fade into history. This one refuses to let go, its echoes bouncing between fact and folklore, forever daring us to separate the two. Dust swirled through the quiet village of Camaron on April 30th, 1863, as 65 men in worn blue coats formed a ragged square around a crumbling hacienda. These weren't ordinary soldiers, they were the French Foreign Legion, a ragtag brotherhood of exiles, criminals, and dreamers bound by one unbreakable oath: the Legion is our homeland. We fight unto death. What followed wasn't just a battle, it was a blood-soaked ballet of defiance that would redefine the meaning of loyalty. Captain Jean Danjou, a leather-gloved veteran with a wooden prosthetic hand, surveyed the horizon where 2,000 Mexican troops advanced like a storm. His order was simple: hold the road at all costs to protect a vital supply convoy. None of them knew the convoy had already been rerouted. They weren't defending supplies anymore, they were defending an idea. The first Mexican cavalry charge broke against the Legion's disciplined volleys, but the numbers were impossible. Danjou ordered a retreat to the hacienda, its thick walls offering slim hope. Inside, the air reeked of gunpowder and sweat as men stacked furniture into barricades, their ammunition dwindling with each passing hour. When a Mexican officer demanded surrender, Danjou's reply became legend: "We have cartridges. We will not surrender." Moments later, a sniper's bullet struck him down. The legionnaires didn't falter. They passed Danjou's wooden hand like a relic, vowing to fight on in his name. By afternoon, the hacienda's courtyard was a charnel house, roofs collapsed from cannon fire, wounded men using broken bayonets as clubs. The last 5 survivors, out of bullets, fixed bayonets for a final charge into the Mexican line. What makes Camaron transcendent isn't the brutality, but the paradox at its core. These were mercenaries technically fighting for pay, not patriotism, yet their loyalty to each other surpassed even national armies. The Legion's code, forged in the Algerian deserts, held that a man's past didn't matter, only his oath did. Compare this to other, dishonorable warriors redeemed by sacrifice. the Swiss Guards dying for Louis XVI at the Tuileries, or the Gurkhas holding their ground against impossible odds. Cameron proved that honor isn't about whose flag you fight under, but what you're willing to bleed for. The aftermath was as surreal as the battle. Mexican General Francisco Milon, witnessing the carnage, ordered his men to cease fire and saluted the 3 remaining legionnaires, all gravely wounded, granting them the right to keep their weapons. "These are not men," he reportedly said. "They are demons." The gesture speaks volumes about the strange kinship between warriors, even enemies. Today, the Legion celebrates Cameron Day with Danju's prosthetic hand paraded like a saint's relic, a tangible link to that day when 65 men held 2,000 at bay for 10 hours. Cameron's legacy slithers into modern military ethos. Special forces from the SAS to Navy SEALs study it not for tactics but for psychology, how far humans can push when everything is lost. The battle also forces uncomfortable questions. Is blind loyalty noble or foolish? Can mercenaries have honor? The Legion's answer, etched in blood at Cameron, is that a vow between outcasts can outshine the grandest ideals of kings. From the dust of Mexico, the thread of last stands pulls us to a different kind of exile, not soldiers in a hacienda, but prisoners in a frozen wasteland. The Dyatlov Pass incident would test the limits of human endurance without a single shot fired, where the enemy wasn't an army, but the indifferent Arctic itself. The grassy hills along the Little Bighorn River seemed to hum with tension on that scorching June morning in 1876. For the Lakota and Cheyenne families camped there, over 7,000 men, women, and children. This was not just a gathering but a defiant act of survival. They'd refused confinement to reservations, choosing instead to follow Sitting Bull's vision of a great victory over the Wassaku, the white invaders. When Lieutenant Colonel George Custer's 7th Cavalry appeared on the horizon, splitting his forces in a reckless pincer maneuver, he assumed he faced a scattered band of warriors. Instead, he'd stumbled upon the largest Native American encampment ever assembled on the plains. What happened next wasn't the heroic last stand of American myth. It was a collision of arrogance and desperation, retold in radically different ways depending on who held the pen. Lakota warrior Rain in the Face later described the chaos with vivid clarity. The soldiers came on like drunken buffalo bulls, shooting blindly. Cheyenne accounts emphasize how Custer's men, already exhausted from forced marches in 100-degree heat, found themselves surrounded by waves of mounted warriors, many armed with superior repeating rifles while the cavalry struggled with single-shot Springfield. The battlefield itself became an adversary. Ravines and gullies that Custer dismissed as minor obstacles instead funneled his troops into killing zones. Women and children watching from nearby hills later recalled the eerie sound of battle, not the orderly volleys of Hollywood films, but a cacophony of war cries, gunfire, and the screams of horses. Within an hour, Custer and all 210 men under his direct command were dead, their bodies strewn across what the victors called the greasy grass. But was this a triumph or a tragedy? For the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne, the victory was fleeting. The U.S. government, humiliated, redoubled its efforts to crush native resistance, starving entire bands into submission within a year. Sitting Bull fled to Canada, while Crazy Horse surrendered only to be bayoneted in custody. The battle's legacy is a paradox, a tactical masterpiece that hastened cultural annihilation. Custer, meanwhile, became both villain and martyr, a symbol of manifest destiny's brutality to some, a fallen hero to others. His widow Libby spent decades sculpting his myth, while native oral histories preserved a counter-narrative of resistance. Even the term "last stand" is contested. Lakota elders called it the battle where the girl saved her brother. after a young woman rescued her sibling mid-charge. Archaeology peels back layers of the myth. Shell casings found clustered on the battlefield suggest some troops may have formed a desperate perimeter, while others fled in panic. Custer's body, stripped and mutilated though not scalped contrary to legend, was found with 2 bullet wounds, one to the chest, another to the temple. Did he take his own life to avoid capture? Forensic evidence remains inconclusive, but the question underscores how little we truly know. The battlefield today, with its stark white markers where each soldier fell, feels less like a monument than a question etched in stone. What does it mean to win a battle but lose a war? This 30th stand forces us to confront the weight of memory itself. Unlike Thermopylae or the Alamo, where defeat was spun into inspiration, Little Bighorn's legacy is fractured, a Rorschach test of cultural perspective. For every statue of Custer, there's a Lakota child who still hears the stories of that day not as a last stand, but as a last gasp of freedom before the reservations closed in. The battle's true lesson may lie in its duality, that history is never a single story, but a chorus of voices, some amplified, some whispered, all echoing across the same blood-stained ground. As we close this journey through 30 final stands, from ancient Thermopylae to the plains of Montana, one thread connects them all: not the glory of battle, but the resilience of the human spirit in the face of inevitable change. Whether holding a pass, a fortress, or a patch of grass, these defenders remind us that how we meet our endings can shape the stories that outlive us. Their choices, defiant, desperate, or dignified, ask us what we would cling to when the world as we know it is slipping away. And perhaps that's the most enduring stand of all, the decision to be remembered not for how we fell, but for what we stood for. 30 final stands, 30 moments where the unthinkable became inevitable, where the line between defeat and legend blurred into something timeless. What binds Leonidas at Thermopylae to the samurai at Shiroyama, or the legionnaires at Cameron to the Lakota at Little Bighorn? Not just courage, though that flickers like a flame through each story. It's something deeper, the unyielding human need to carve meaning into the face of oblivion. These battles weren't just about territory or power. They were about who gets to write the next chapter of history and who becomes a footnote. Leadership emerges as the first thread, not the polished command of textbooks, but the raw, visceral kind that thrives in chaos. Men like Scipio Aemilianus at Carthage and Khalid ibn al-Walid at Yarmouk didn't just direct armies, they rewrote the rules of war. Yet leadership also wore quieter faces. The Cherokee marching westward, their Trail of Tears, a last stand without battlefields where resilience became their weapon. And what of the leaders who fell? Cuauhtémoc, Vercingetorix, Constantine XI, their defeats often birthed legends far louder than their victories ever could. Sacrifice, too, weaves through these stories, but never uniformly. At Masada and Chittorgarh, it was collective, a choice to deny the enemy even the satisfaction of conquest. For others, like the Swiss Guards at the Tuileries or the Winged Hussars at Vienna, sacrifice was a profession, an oath upheld to the last breath. And then there's the sacrifice of identity, seen in the samurai's fading code or the Aztecs' burning temples, where cultures didn't just die, they transformed, their embers igniting new fires elsewhere. But the most haunting thread, how these stands defy simple endings. The Alamo's defenders became martyrs for Texan independence, yet their story obscures Mexico's own fight against American expansion. The Zulu triumph at Isandlwana delayed colonialism but couldn't stop it. Even in loss, these moments became compass points for nations, religions, and movements. The fall of Constantinople didn't just end an empire, it scattered Greek scholars westward, fueling the Renaissance. The Tangut erasure by Genghis Khan left gaps in history that archaeologists still piece together today. Defeat, it seems, can be a seed as much as a tomb. So which stand resonates with you? Is it the doomed brilliance of Archimedes at Syracuse, scribbling equations as the walls fell? Or the quiet defiance of the Cherokee, turning a forced march into an unbroken song? History's last stands aren't just relics, they're mirrors. They ask us what we'd cling to when the world shifts beneath our feet. Subscribe and join us as we keep unearthing these tangled, triumphant, tragic tales. Drop a comment below. What's your last stand, real or imagined? And remember, whether it's Thermopylae's hot gates or a frozen pass in the Andes, it's never the fall that defines us. It's how we choose to meet.